Hey guys, today we're going to talk a little bit about some background for the ancient India unit. So we're going to start talking about the Indus River Valley because this, like our other previous units, is a river valley civilization, meaning that the civilization itself grew up along a river. And we've discussed in the past why this is so important. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So just a little bit of geography about India. So what physical feature did ancient India settle around? Well, we just went over that, guys. It settled around a river. And actually, it settled around two rivers. It settled around the Indus River and the Ganges River. So India itself is located in Asia, which is a continent. India is also a peninsula. This means that it is surrounded by water on three sides, and that it is a subcontinent, meaning that it is so big that it's considered a piece of a continent, a large piece. Now, a lot of you would know what a peninsula is if you were to think about the state of Florida. That is the typical peninsula that we think about when we hear that word, and India is one of them. So India is called the Indus River Valley because it was built along the Indus River. So you're going to hear those two words used interchangeably, ancient India, Indus River Valley, and they mean the same thing. Some of the other major physical features of ancient India, or of India in general, is the Thar Desert, the Himalaya Mountains, the Deccan Plateau, the Indus and Ganges rivers, the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and the Bay of Bengal. And we know that these multiple things make protection of ancient India really, really good because nobody's going to want to cross over a harsh desert or tall mountains to get to you to take you over. So it helped them to retain a lot of their culture. Resources from the land. Because the Indus River Valley has a ton of natural resources. And natural resources just means that things that come from the land, things that they can use to help build and grow their civilization. They have plenty of fresh water from the rivers. They have timber, which is wood essentially, so they can use that to build a lot of things. They have gold and silver, which they use for multiple things, whether that was for trading goods or for making goods to trade. And they also have semi-precious stones, things like emeralds and rubies. And they also have marine resources like fish. So a lot of their diet is composed of fish, which we see a lot of. This is an example of human environment interaction. It's how the environment affects the way that you live. And because they live by so many sources of water, their diet is going to contain mostly fish because that's what is available to them. Now, their natural resources are created more to trade than anything else. And this has created an independence from others. So their civilization doesn't need to trade to survive. And it was really hard for them to trade because of all of those um, physical features that we talked about from the previous slide. Because even though it offers them protection, it also offers them a barrier to trade. So it's going to make it much more difficult because just like somebody doesn't want to cross a desert or cross mountains to invade your civilization, you're not going to want to cross them to trade with other people. So that's really important to note that they didn't need to trade to survive. A lot of civilizations can only survive based on trade because they don't have everything that they need. We can assume from this that ancient India did have everything that they needed, and they were able to not just survive, but thrive, which means do really, really well. So ancient India is made up of various empires, and we're going to talk about empires going forward. Um, so the first empire is the Aryans. Aryans are nomadic and warlike, and remember that nomadic means that they are moving around. They don't have a permanent settlement yet. And this is the first empire because they actually invade India. They were bold and they took control. So they had the guts to cross that desert, cross the mountains, cross the oceans in order to get to India, and they take it over. This leads to a changing life in the Indus River Valley because the Aryans brought their own religion called Hinduism, which we talked about last week, which is why we did Hinduism first. So Hinduism actually um, influences this portion of the Indus River Valley because of the way that they practice their religion. So it changes the way that they live. The other thing that they brought with them was a strict social class. So that social class of the 8 common factors called the caste system, which we'll learn more about in a little bit. Some of the contributions to the empire, again, caste system. And the caste system are classes based off of the Vedas, which are historical texts and religious texts. And again, Hinduism. Hinduism is still around today, so it's one of the greatest contributions that Aryans have given to the Indus River Valley and areas around there is this religion. The Second Empire. The Second Empire is the Mauryans, and these had two important leaders, each with many, many achievements. The first leader or ruler, and excuse me for mispronouncing this, is Chandragupta Maurya. He's really important because he has an army that unites northern India, and he gives up the rulership to become a monk. And so his son took over as ruler. And when a son takes over for a father over and over again, this creates a dynasty. And we learned about dynasties when we talked about ancient Egypt. Now, the second ruler that's extremely important, his name is Ashoka or Ashoka. And he fought in many bloody wars to increase the size of his kingdom. So he was also extremely bold and daring because he was able to expand through this thing that we just talked about, that people didn't want to cross these barriers because of how dangerous they were. But yet he did it anyway, and he made the empire bigger. He's important because he also became a Buddhist, which practices like nonviolence, and Ashoka was extremely sick and tired of the bloodshed, and so he converted to Buddhism because he wanted to practice and show people that he was nonviolent. So he was really tired of watching people destroy one another. And again, we just learned about Buddhism earlier this week. So I want you to keep those two things in mind, Hinduism and Buddhism, as we go through the rest of the slides. Some of the accomplishments of the Mauryans. So they actually built rest houses. So think of them as like rest stops along the highway that were built along the trade routes. So although they didn't need trade to survive, they did still trade. And because of the harsh nature of the environment, they created these houses for people to stop at to make trading amongst the empires easier. And then they also built roads within the empire to help them trade. So again, even though they don't need to trade, it makes their civilization better and stronger and more powerful if they're able to do so. This empire also encouraged the spread of Buddhism by building stone pillars along the road that showed what Buddhism was all about. And the third empire is called the Gupta Empire. So the rulers of the Gupta Empire conquered and gained control of all of the Ganges River Valley. So we've been talking mainly about the Indus River Valley, and as noted earlier, ancient India grows up along two different rivers, the Indus and the Ganges. So the Gupta Empire is around the Ganges, and you can see here in the photo that the Gupta Empire is mainly in northern India. So after they conquered the land, the Gupta Empire entered into what is called a golden age. And a golden age is a time period where there's a lot of peace, there is progress, so they are making developments, and there's prosperity, so people are wealthy and they're well off and they're not wanting for anything. And just about every civilization will have some sort of golden age unless they are a baby civilization and fall before they can really rise. So it's really important to know that a golden age is defined by the three P's: peace, progress, prosperity. So some of the contributions of the Gupta dynasty, they built colleges and universities, so they were able to send people there to get educated. Hinduism became the main religion again, so you can see that we've gone back and forth between Hinduism and Buddhism. which again, we've learned about both, so we should have an idea of how those religions influenced the people that lived during that time. They also have a ton of literature and paintings. Roads, which again encouraged not just trade, but the exchange of ideas. So this is where we're talking about movement, because movement is not just the movement of goods and products and people, it's also the movement of ideas. So ideas and what they were thinking were able to spread further and wider because of the roads. Then they also gave us their numeric system, which started to use a decimal point and a zero, which is a completely new concept during this time. So that caste system that we were talking about, social hierarchy, one of our 8 common factors of civilization. Okay, so you can see here from the chart that the caste system is broken into 5 different, categories. It's broken into the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaisyas, the Shudra, and the Untouchables. And we'll talk more about that going forward. So the caste system, every person had a role to play in India's society. And each of the different groups here in the pyramid had their own job and responsibilities to fulfill. When a person was born into a group, they are not allowed to change at any point. Once you're born into that group, that's where you stay. So if you were born a Kshatriya, you are going to stay in that group. If you are born an untouchable, you are going to stay an untouchable, and that's not something that you want to be. People in one group are not allowed to marry people in another, so there was no way for them to change their social status. And all parts of the social pyramid come from the Vedas, which is the religious text of Hinduism. And again, we're going to learn more about the caste system tomorrow and a little bit later next week, because it is something that has influenced the lives of ancient Indians and Indians even today. This is just a bigger version um, of that social pyramid. So you can see here that the group of the Brahmins was made up of priests, judges, and scholars. And because they're at the top of the pyramid, it means that they are the top class. So they usually have the most power, the most money, and the most influence. But this is also the smallest number of people. Next after that, we have the Kshatriyas, which are rulers and soldiers. So they really valued their soldiers. Then we have the Vaisyas. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. These are merchants and farmers. This is our middle class. Then we have the Shudra, which are peasants, servants, and laborers. And this is one of the biggest classes and made up of the most people. And then we actually, in ancient India, have something called the Dalits, which are also known as untouchables. And this is not a class you wanted to be born into. These are professions that were deemed unclean, or people who were shunned so harshly that nobody in society wanted anything to do with them, hence the name untouchables. This is actually a class that doesn't exist anymore today. So some of the contributions that were made from ancient India to today's society, also known as innovations. We have this writing system called Sanskrit. And this is just what the ancient Indians, used to keep their records. They also gave us universities and colleges where people could study and developed new trade routes and irrigation systems. So they're actually developing more technology, not technology in the sense of what you know it, but technology in the way that they would know it, meaning things that improved their life for that time period. So technology doesn't always have to do with things that are like electronic based. A lot of you are going to think about, iPods and AirPods, and iPads as technology, but technology could even be a pencil. Technology, or the definition of technology, depends on the time period you're talking about. If it's new for that time period, it's considered a technological advance. We also see their numeric or number system. Again, they use the decimal place value system that uses digits like we use today and zeros as placeholders. What I think is probably the most cool is their indoor toilets and drainage system. So they actually create bathrooms with pipes running to a sewer under the street. That's considered a public work, guys. So a public work is something that the government creates or pays for that everybody can use, including our sewer systems. We still have them today. It's still considered a public work. Okay, so they create these sewer systems that run under the street, and they actually have running water from the fountain that ran off under the bathroom, carrying off waste. So in a lot of societies going forward, this is extremely advanced because a lot of their waste was just dumped into the street, which is bleh, disgusting. And then again, they've got roads. So they use these roads for trading of goods and ideas. Cultural diffusion was a big part of helping India spread their ideas to other areas, which is how ideas change over time. To get a more in-depth understanding of this topic and to get a little bit more background, we're going to go ahead and watch the Indus River Valley John Green video. And let's go ahead and start it.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course World History. Let's begin today with a question. Why am I alive? Also, why don't I have any eyes? That's better. The way we answer that question ends up organizing all kinds of other thoughts, like what we should value and how we should behave and if we should eat meat and whether we should dump that boy who is very nice but insanely clingy in a way that he cannot possibly think is attractive. All of which Mr. Green, are you talking about me? Yes, I am talking about you, me from the past. I am telling you that one of the reasons we study history is so that you can be a less terrible boyfriend, but more on that momentarily. Today we're going to talk about civilizations, but in order to do that, we have to talk about talking about civilizations because it's a problematic word. So problematic, in fact, that I have to turn to camera 2 to discuss it. Certain conglomerations of humans are seen as civilizations, whereas, say, nomadic cultures generally aren't, unless you are, say it with me, the Mongols. By calling some groups civilizations, you imply that all other social orders are uncivilized, which is basically just another way of saying that they're savages or barbarians. Side note, originally Greek, the word barbarian denoted anyone who did not speak ancient Greek, because to the Greeks all other languages sounded like bar, 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 bar. So that is to say that we are all essentially barbarians, except for the classics majors, which is worth remembering when we're discussing civilizations. Civilizations are like most of the things we like to study. They're intellectual constructs. No one woke up in the city of Thebes in Egypt one morning and said, "What a beautiful morning. I sure am living at the height of Egyptian civilization." Still, they're useful constructs, particularly when you're comparing one civilization to another. They're less useful when you're comparing a civilization to a non-civilization type social order, which is why we will try to avoid that. And yes, I am getting to the good boyfriend stuff. Patience, grasshopper. So what is a civilization? Well, diagnosing a civilization is a little like diagnosing an illness. If you have 4 or more of the following symptoms, you might be a civilization. Surplus production. Once one person can make enough food to feed several people, it becomes possible to build a city, another symptom of civilization. It also leads to the specialization of labor, which in turn leads to trade. Like if everybody picks berries for a living, there is no reason to trade because I have berries and you have berries. But if I pick berries for a living and you make hammers, suddenly we have cause to trade. Civilizations are also usually associated with social stratification, centralized government, shared values, generally in the form of religion and writing. And at least in the early days, they were almost always associated with rivers. These days, you can just bisect a segment of land horizontally and vertically and boom, build a city. But 5,000 years ago, civilizations were almost always associated with rivers, whether that's the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Yellow River, the Nile, the Amazon Basin, the Coatzacoalcos. God, I was doing so good until I got to Coatzacoalcos.
Coatzacoalcos.
Coatzacoalcos, maybe. Why river valleys? They're flat, they're well watered, and when they flood, they deposit nutrient-rich silt. We'll have more to say about most of these civilizations later, but let's talk about this guy, the Indus Valley Civilization, because it's my all-time favorite. The Indus Valley Civilization was located in the floodplain of the Indus and Sawardi rivers, and it was about the best place in the world to have an ancient civilization because the rivers flooded very reliably twice a year, which meant that it had the most available calories per acre of pretty much anywhere on the planet. We know the Indus Valley Civilization flourished a long time ago, probably around 3000 BCE. Why is that question literally hanging over my head? But people of the Indus Valley were trading with Mesopotamians as early as 3500 BCE. We also know that it was the largest of the ancient civilizations, civilizations, archaeologists have discovered more than 1,500 sites. So what do we know about this civilization? Let's go to the thought bubble. Everything we know about the Indus Valley civilization comes from archaeology, because while they did use written language, we don't know how to read it, and no Rosetta Stone has thus far appeared to help us learn it. I meant the other Rosetta Stone thought bubble. Yeah. Although, come to think of it, either would be acceptable. So here's what we know. They had amazing cities. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are the best known, with dense, multi-story homes constructed out of uniformly sized bricks along perpendicular streets. I mean, this wasn't some ancient world version of Houston, more like Chicago. This means they must have had some form of government and zoning, but we don't know what gave this government its authority. Cities were oriented to catch the wind and provide a natural form of air conditioning. And they were clean. Most homes were connected to a centralized drainage system that used gravity to carry waste and water out of the city in big sewer ditches that ran under the main avenues, a plumbing system that would have been the envy of many 18th century European cities. Also, in Mohenjo-Daro, the largest public building was not a temple or a palace, but a public bath, which historians call the Great Bath. We don't know what the Great Bath was used for, but since later Indian culture placed a huge emphasis on ritual purity, which is the basis for the caste system, some historians have speculated that the bath might have been like a giant baptismal pool. Also, they traded. One of the coolest things that the Indus Valley civilization produced were seals used as identification markers on goods and clay tablets. These seals contain the writing that we still can't decipher and a number of fantastic designs, many featuring animals and monsters. One of the most famous and frightening is of a man with what looks like water buffalo horns on his head, sitting cross-legged between a tiger and a bull. We don't know what's really going on here, but it's safe to say that this was a powerful dude because he seems to be able to control the tiger. How did these seals let us know that they traded? Well, because we found them in Mesopotamia, not the Indus Valley. Plus, archaeologists have found stuff like bronze in the Indus Valley that is not native to the region. So what did they trade? Cotton cloth. Still such a fascinating export, incidentally, that it will be the subject of the 40th and final video in this very series. But here's the most amazing thing about the Indus Valley people. They were peaceful. Despite archaeologists finding 1,500 sites, they have found very little evidence of warfare and almost no weapons. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Okay, before we talk about the fascinating demise of the Indus Valley civilization, it's time for the open letter. Magic! I wonder what the secret compartment has for me today. Oh, fancy clothes! I guess the secret compartment didn't think I was dressed up enough for the occasion. An open letter to historians. Dear historians, the Great Bath? Really? The Great Bath? I'm trying to make history fascinating and you give me a term that evokes scented candles, bath salts, and Frederick Fekkai hair products? I know sometimes the crushingly boring names of history aren't your fault. You didn't name the Federalist Papers or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or Adam Smith. But when you do get a chance to name something, you go with the Great Bath, not the epic bath of Mohenjo-Daro, or the bath to end all baths, or the pool that ruled, or the moist mystery of Mohenjo-Daro, or the wet wonder. The Great Bath? Really? You can do better. Best wishes, John Green. So what happened to these people? Well, here's what didn't happen to them. They didn't morph into the current residents of that area of the world, Hindu Indians or Muslim Pakistanis. Those people probably came from the Caucasus. Instead, sometime around 1750 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization declined until it faded into obscurity. Why? Historians have three theories. One, conquest. Turns out to be a terrible military strategy not to have any weapons, and it's possible people from the Indus Valley were completely overrun by people from the Caucasus. Two, environmental disaster. It's possible they brought about their own end by destroying their environment. Three, earthquake. The most interesting theory is that a massive earthquake changed the course of the rivers so much that a lot of the tributaries dried up. Without adequate water supplies for irrigation, the cities couldn't sustain themselves, so people literally just picked up and left for greener pastures. Well, probably not pastures. It's unlikely they became nomads. They probably just moved to a different plane and continued their agricultural ways. I am already boring you, and I haven't even told you yet how to be a better boy and or girlfriend. I'm gonna do that now. So we don't know why the Indus Valley civilization ended, but we also don't really know why it started. Why did these people build cities and dig swimming pools and make unnecessarily ornate seals? Were they motivated by hunger, fear, a desire for companionship, the need to be near their sacred spaces, or a general feeling that city life was just more awesome than foraging? Thinking about what motivated them to structure their life as they did helps us to think about how we structure our own lives. In short, you're clingy because you're motivated by fear and a need for companionship. And she finds it annoying because it's enough work having to be responsible for herself herself without having to also be responsible for you. Also, you're not really helping her by clinging, and from the Indus Valley in the Bronze Age to school life today, human life is all about collaboration. Trading cloth for bronze, building cities together, and collaborating to make sure that human lives are tilted to catch the wind. Next week, we will travel here to discuss the hot Mesopotamia, but in the meantime, if you have any questions, leave them in comments, and our team of semi-trained semi-professionals will do their best to answer them. Also, you'll find some suggested resources in the video info below, he said, pointing at his pants. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. Today's episode of Crash Course was produced and directed by Stan Muller. The show was written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself. Our graphics team is Thought Bubble, and our script supervisor is Danica Johnson. Last week's phrase of the week was double cheeseburger. If you want to take
So go ahead and take the rest of this time and just think about all of the information that John Green has presented us and all the information from our notes. We'll be using this going forward to talk about the rest of the ancient Indus River Valley civilization.